The day they laughed at me, the sun was merciless, and the world felt too wide for a boy who owned nothing but a tray of groundnuts and a dream too foolish to say aloud. I can still feel the heat of that afternoon crawling up my neck as I stood before the great university gate, that wall of knowledge I was never meant to cross. They laughed so loud that their laughter chased me home that night, echoing against my ribs, daring me to believe that I could ever be more than the boy who sold nuts in the dust. I didn't know then that one day those same voices would rise again, not in laughter, but in applause. I was 15 when I first began selling roasted groundnuts outside the university. My father had died young, leaving behind a debt so heavy that even the walls of our one-room house seemed to lean from the burden. My mother's hands were cracked from years of washing other people's clothes, and I used to tell her that someday I'd buy her a house with windows that didn't leak when it rained. She would smile and say, "You'll have to learn before you can earn, my son." But learning costs money, and all I had were groundnuts, smoke, and stubbornness. Every morning before the city stirred, I lit my charcoal stove and roasted the nuts, the smoke stinging my eyes and filling the air with that sweet, salty smell that always reminded me of hope. By noon, I'd balance the tray on my head, tie a rag around my wrist, and begin the long walk to the university. That place fascinated me. Its tall buildings, its green lawns, its students carrying books like treasure chests. I used to watch them from a distance, wondering how it felt to know so much, to belong to a world where the future wasn't a rumor, but a promise. That afternoon, as I called out, "Groundnut, fresh groundnut," a group of students came out laughing. They were clean, confident, their voices filled with a kind of joy I had never owned. One of them, tall, with sunglasses and a gold wristwatch, pointed at me and said something that made the others burst into laughter. I didn't hear the words clearly, but I knew the sound of mockery. It clung to me like sweat. I forced a smile and handed them a paper cone of nuts. My fingers trembled as I took the money, but they didn't stop laughing. One of the girls whispered, "Poor boy. Maybe one day he'll buy his own books." I wanted to tell her that I already read, that I read newspapers I found in trash bins and traced words with my finger until I memorized them. But I stayed silent. Silence was safer. When I turned to leave, the boy with the glasses called out again. He tossed a coin to the ground between us, the silver flashing in the dust. "Pick it up, groundnut boy," he said, "if you really need it." The others laughed again, loud and cruel, like music made of knives. I stared at the coin for what felt like forever. My mind screamed to walk away, but my body wouldn't move. I could hear my mother's voice somewhere inside me. "Don't ever let poverty teach you shame." So I bent down slowly, picked up the coin, wiped it clean, and placed it gently on the tray. Then I looked at him, steady and calm, and said, "You dropped your money, sir. I sell groundnuts, not dignity." For the first time, the laughter stopped. Their eyes shifted, uncertain, uneasy. I turned and walked away, my tray heavy but my heart burning with something I had never felt before. Not anger, but awakening. That night, as I sat counting my earnings under the dull flicker of our lantern, I realized that humiliation can be a strange kind of teacher. It doesn't whisper. It roars. It tells you what you never want to feel again, and dares you to rise above it. I promised myself then that one day I would walk through that university gate, not as a hawker, but as someone whose name they would learn to respect. But destiny is a patient sculptor, and it never carves without pain. The next morning, when I returned to the university gate, I found a small crowd gathered, and among them was the same boy with the sunglasses, holding something in his hand that would change the course of my life forever. There are gates made of iron, and there are gates made of fear, and the one before the university was built of both. It didn't just keep me out. It reminded me, every single day, of everything I was not. Yet even from the dusty side of that fence, I could feel knowledge breathing through its bars, calling me in whispers that only hunger and hope could hear. I didn't realize then that the same gate that mocked my poverty would one day open not just for my feet, but for my purpose. After that humiliating afternoon, when the students laughed at me and I returned home burning with quiet fury, something inside me shifted. The next morning, when I walked back to that same gate with my tray of roasted groundnuts balanced on my head, I wasn't the same boy who had walked away with shame in his chest. I was still barefoot, still hungry, but my heart carried a new kind of defiance, the kind that refuses to die quietly. The laughter that once broke me had become my reason to return. I remember standing by the university fence, the metal bars hot beneath my fingertips, listening to the voices drifting through the open windows of lecture halls. The words that escaped those walls felt like music from another universe. Strange syllables, heavy phrases, the language of people who had never known what it meant to go hungry. But I wanted to understand them. I began to repeat their words softly to myself, rolling them on my tongue until they felt like my own. I didn't know what anthropology or metaphysics meant, but I whispered them into the wind as if they were spells that might open doors someday. The guards grew used to chasing me away. They shouted, "Go sell your nuts somewhere else," waving their batons as if they were warding off a beggar. Sometimes I ran, sometimes I didn't. I had learned something powerful, that when you keep showing up to the same place, even the world that rejects you begins to get used to your presence. Then came Amina. I first noticed her because she didn't walk like the others. There was a calmness in her step, a quietness in her eyes that carried kindness rather than pride. She always bought groundnuts, never haggled over the price, and once said, "You look at this gate like it owes you something." Her voice had no mockery in it, only curiosity. I told her, "Maybe it does." She smiled, tilting her head slightly. "Maybe it does," she repeated. From then on, she bought from me often. Some days she would stop for a moment longer, asking how business was or what I wanted to do with my life. I didn't have an answer. Dreams were things people like her could afford. People like me just tried to survive the day. But she kept talking, as if she was trying to remind me of something I hadn't yet learned to believe, that even a hawker's heart could hold ambition. One afternoon, she said something that would haunt me long after. She held out her paper cone of groundnuts, looked at me seriously, and said, "You don't belong out here, you know. You belong there." Her eyes flicked toward the gate. "Someday, you'll understand that." She walked away before I could reply, leaving me standing there, my pulse thundering like a drum. That night, her words wouldn't leave me. I lay awake under the flickering glow of our small kerosene lamp, the smell of smoke and peanuts still clinging to my hands. "You belong there." The phrase repeated itself in my mind until it became a command. I decided that if I couldn't enter the university, I would learn from its shadows. I began collecting old newspapers from dustbins near the market, smoothing out the torn pages, tracing each printed word with my finger until I could pronounce it aloud. I didn't understand every story, but each headline was a window, each word a key. Days passed, then weeks. The guards still chased me, but less often now. I had become part of the scenery, the boy with the tray, the echo of determination by the gate. Amina kept coming, always asking questions that made me think. She talked about medicine, about healing, about making her parents proud. I listened in silence, learning not just from her words, but from her fire. Somewhere deep inside, I began to believe that maybe she was right. Maybe I didn't belong outside forever. Then one evening, the sky turned the color of bruised metal, and thunder rolled over the horizon. The wind carried the smell of rain and roasted nuts as I waited by the gate, hoping to see Amina's familiar blue scarf among the crowd of students leaving for the day. The guards were locking up early because of the storm, shouting for everyone to hurry, but Amina didn't come. I waited until the first drops fell, soaking my tray, my clothes, my hope. Finally, I asked another student, "Have you seen Amina today?" He stopped, hesitated, and looked down. His voice was barely a whisper. "She collapsed during class. They took her to the hospital." The world seemed to tilt. The rain fell harder, washing over my tray until the nuts floated like tiny boats. I stood frozen, unable to breathe, staring at the gate. That cruel line between me and the only person who had ever seen my worth. That night, I stood outside the hospital window, watching the raindrops slide down the glass like tears I refused to shed. The nurse came out with her face pale and quiet, and before she spoke, I already knew. The light inside flickered once, then went out. And with it, the one voice that had told me I could be more than a hawker. From that moment, I understood. The gate hadn't just divided my dreams. It had stolen something I could never get back. That night, I stopped hearing my mother's cough and started hearing my own promise. The silence that followed her final breath was the kind that doesn't just fill a room, it fills a life. There is a sound the world makes when someone who held your whole story inside them suddenly lets go. And in that stillness, I felt something in me shatter. Not from grief alone, but from the unbearable truth that I now had no one left to believe in me, but myself. The rain hadn't stopped since the day Amina died. The sky seemed determined to mourn with me, pouring until the streets turned to rivers of mud. I was still standing at the edge of the university gate when a neighbor came running, shouting my name. Her face told me everything before her words reached my ears. My mother had collapsed. By the time I reached home, soaked and trembling, she was lying still, her lips pale, her chest unmoving. The lantern beside her had burned halfway down, its light shaking as though afraid to go out completely. I fell to my knees beside her and took her hand, rough and cold, the hand that had once guided mine as I learned to count coins. Her eyes opened for a moment, cloudy, but aware. She smiled faintly, that same tired smile she used to give me whenever I came home late from selling nuts. And with a voice barely louder than the rain, she whispered, "Never let poverty teach you shame." Then her fingers slipped from mine, and the room went silent except for the storm outside. I don't remember much of the burial, only the weight of the soil hitting the wooden coffin, the dull thuds that sounded like doors closing in my chest. After that, I returned to selling groundnuts because grief, no matter how deep, does not buy food. Each morning, I walked past the same university gate, the same guards, the same laughter, only now it all felt farther away, as though the world had shifted one step beyond my reach. But my mother's last words followed me like a haunting melody. Never let poverty teach you shame. So I began working harder. I sold groundnuts. Through rain and heat, through exhaustion and loneliness. I talked to other hawkers, mostly boys younger than me, and started showing them how to count change faster, how to save a coin from every sale. I told them stories about Amina, about the girl who believed a hawker could dream, and about my mother, who died believing that knowledge could heal anything. I didn't know it then, but teaching them was teaching myself. When I explained numbers, I learned patience. When I told them not to give up, I began to understand resilience. Life had taken everything from me except the will to rise, and I wasn't going to waste that. One evening, while showing a younger boy how to add prices without counting on fingers, a man in a brown coat stopped near us. His eyes were old, but curious. He watched quietly as I spoke, then said, "You teach well for someone who never went to school." I straightened my back and replied, "I just listen when people smarter than me speak." The man chuckled softly and said, "Listening is learning. Most people never understand that." He bought 2 cones of groundnuts and lingered, asking my name. When I told him, he nodded thoughtfully. "You remind me of my students years ago," he said. before I retired. That was how I met Mr. Salim, a retired schoolteacher who lived 2 streets away. For the next few weeks, he began stopping by more often, asking me small questions, testing what I knew. One day, he placed a folded piece of paper in my hand, an old notebook page filled with letters and words. "Do you know how to read this?" he asked. I shook my head. He smiled, not with pity, but with recognition. "If you can learn to sell," he said, "you can learn to read." From that night onward, my evenings changed. After selling for the day, I'd wash my hands, light a small candle, and sit on the floor beside him as he taught me to shape letters, to sound out words, to see meaning where once I saw only marks. My first written word was hope. I wrote it slowly, pressing hard enough that the paper nearly tore. For the first time since my mother's death, I felt something other than grief, a spark of purpose, faint but steady. Mr. Salim would often say, "Books are doors, son. Each one opens to a place poverty cannot follow." I didn't tell him, but I had already chosen which door I wanted most to open, the one that stood at the university gate. One night, as we finished a lesson under the faint glow of the candle, he looked at me differently, his eyes sharp with certainty. "You have the mind of a scholar," he said quietly, "if you're brave enough to prove it." His words hung in the air like a dare. I looked at the gate in the distance, the same one that had stolen Amina and mocked my dreams, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt the beginning of a promise waiting to be kept. I cleaned the classroom floors where I wasn't allowed to learn. Every stroke of my mop was a silent plea to the gods of knowledge. Every bucket of dirty water, a symbol of the distance between who I was and who I longed to become. Sometimes I could hear the echo of students laughing above me, their voices floating through corridors like a language I wasn't yet fluent in, a language of belonging. I didn't have a seat in that world, but I was willing to scrub the floors just to stay close to it. After weeks of learning letters under Mr. Salim's dim candlelight, he came to me one morning with a piece of paper folded carefully in his hands. "The university is hiring cleaners," he said. "It's not a classroom, but it's a step closer." My hands trembled as I took the paper. That afternoon, I walked into the university compound, not as a vendor, not as a trespasser, but as a worker. It wasn't admission, but it was entry, and that alone felt sacred. The scent of chalk and polish filled the hallways. My first task was to clean Lecture Hall 2, the same hall I had once stood outside, listening through the open windows. As I dragged my mop across the marble floor, I could hear a professor explaining something about economic growth and social mobility. I didn't know what those words meant, but the tone in his voice made me pause. I found myself slowing my work, pretending to focus on a stubborn stain just so I could keep listening. When the students left, I stayed behind, walking between the rows of desks like a ghost in someone else's world. Crumpled pages littered the floor. I picked them up one by one: lecture notes, assignment drafts, scribbled equations. At first, they were meaningless marks on paper, but each night, under my flickering lamp, I'd trace them slowly, trying to connect sounds to shapes, patterns to purpose. Days turned into weeks. My back ached, my hands cracked, but my mind was alive. The more I cleaned, the more I learned. I began recognizing words from lectures: inflation, democracy, justice. Each one felt like a piece of treasure pulled from the mud. The guards didn't chase me anymore. I was part of the invisible machinery that made the university run, the boy who swept floors and carried buckets, too ordinary to notice. But fate notices the ones who don't give up. One evening, after everyone had left, I was sitting cross-legged on the floor of Lecture Hall 2, reading from a torn notebook I'd rescued from the trash. The chalkboard still held the day's notes, half-erased equations glowing pale in the light of the setting sun. I was mouthing the words quietly, trying to make sense of them, when the door creaked open. I froze. Standing there was the professor whose lectures I'd been listening to for weeks, tall, gray-haired, eyes sharp as glass. I jumped to my feet so fast that the notebook slipped from my hands. My first instinct was to apologize, to explain, to beg not to be reported. My voice cracked as I stammered. I was just cleaning, sir." The words came out thin, like a lie. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he bent down, picked up the notebook, and turned a few pages. His expression didn't show anger. It showed curiosity. "You've been reading this?" he asked. I swallowed hard. "Trying to, sir." He looked at me for what felt like forever. Then his eyes softened, and for the first time, someone inside that university didn't see a cleaner. He saw a student. "Tell me," he said quietly. "Why do you want to learn this?" I didn't think so. I just spoke the truth. Because the world keeps its doors locked for those who can't read the signs. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, a small smile broke across his face. He handed the notebook back to me and said, "If you want to learn, come tomorrow. I'll teach you myself." His voice was calm, but the meaning thundered through my chest like destiny arriving at last. As he walked away, the empty classroom suddenly felt alive, not with echoes of other people's lessons, but with the promise of my own beginning. For 6 months, I was a student no one knew existed. I learned in the quiet hours when corridors slept and classrooms whispered with ghosts of knowledge left behind. By day, I swept dust from the university floors. By night, I brushed the same dust off my borrowed books, tracing wisdom with hands that smelled of soap and groundnuts. The world outside saw only a cleaner, but beneath the silence of my labor, a new identity was being born. One built not on privilege, but persistence. The professor kept his promise. The very next evening, when the sun dipped behind the lecture halls, he returned, carrying 2 old textbooks under his arm. He placed them on a desk and said simply, "We'll start with these." I remember touching the covers with reverence, my fingers trembling as though they held something sacred. The pages smelled of chalk and time. I didn't understand half the words written inside, but I read them anyway, clinging to every line as if it contained the code to unlock my destiny. Our lessons took place in secret. After his official lectures ended, he would stay behind under the pretense of grading papers, and I would quietly slip into the back of the hall with my broom and bucket. When the last footsteps faded, he would close the door and begin teaching. Sometimes we sat in the dim glow of the projector, sometimes under the faint light from the corridor outside. He never spoke loudly, as though knowledge itself was a fragile secret that could shatter if heard by the wrong ears. He gave me more than books. He gave me belief. "You don't have to be born inside these walls to deserve what they offer," he once said. Those words became the fuel that kept me awake, long after the candle burned down. I studied at night, lying on the cool cement floor of my small room, the flame flickering over equations and paragraphs that made my eyes ache, but my heart soar. When the candle died, I memorized it by moonlight. I hid my books inside my groundnut tray every morning before work. To everyone else it was just a tray filled with roasted nuts and paper cones. But to me, it carried the weight of a future I refused to surrender. During lunch breaks, I'd sneak behind the campus wall, open a page, and read a paragraph aloud, repeating words until they sounded like home. I didn't care if I pronounced them wrong. Every misstep was a step forward. The guards still shouted at me when they saw me lingering by the classrooms during the day. They didn't know that the boy they were chasing away already studied inside those halls after dark. Sometimes I wondered if life enjoyed its little ironies, to let me scrub the same floors that would one day echo with my name. 6 months passed like a fever. Painful, sleepless, but transformative. My world expanded beyond what hunger or hardship could contain. I began to understand how the economy worked, how societies grew, how power moved, not through fists or wealth, but through knowledge. The professor watched me carefully during lessons, his eyes proud but measured, as if he saw something unfolding that even I couldn't see yet. Then one evening, while we reviewed a set of practice questions, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You remind me of myself when I was young, restless, angry, but curious." I smiled, unsure what to say. He looked at me for a long moment before continuing. "You've learned everything I can teach you like this," he said slowly. "Now you must prove it to yourself." He reached into his bag and pulled out a single folded paper, a university entrance exam form. My hands froze as he placed it on the table. The printed words blurred before my eyes. He said quietly, "You're ready to sit for this exam, if you can pay the fee." The words hit me harder than any slap life had given before. The form lay between us like a bridge built from dreams and desperation. But on the other side stood a wall, named poverty. I looked at him, at the paper, and then at my calloused hands. Hands that had known only labor, never luxury. I wanted to believe I was ready, but readiness meant nothing without the means to try. As I walked home that night, the streets felt longer, the world heavier, and one question echoed in my chest. How much does a dream truly cost? I sold my last tray of groundnuts to buy a piece of paper that could change my life. It wasn't just a form, it was a fragile bridge between the boy I had been and the man I wanted to become. As I counted the coins one final time under the trembling glow of a candle, I realized I wasn't just paying a fee. I was buying my chance to stand where I was once forbidden to step. Every coin that clinked against the others sounded like a heartbeat, scared but determined. The professor's words had followed me home that night, echoing through the darkness. "You're ready, if you can pay the fee." Ready. That word haunted me. I was ready to learn, ready to fight, ready to give up sleep and comfort. But I wasn't ready to face how much poverty could cost a dream. For days, I worked longer hours, sold nuts until my feet bled, skipped meals to save every coin. Still, it wasn't enough. On the 7th night, I sat on the floor beside my tray, the smell of roasted nuts thick in the air, my stomach hollow from hunger. Mr. Salim stopped by and saw the exhaustion in my eyes. Without a word, he placed an envelope on the tray. Inside were a few crumpled notes. "A teacher's salary isn't much," he said softly, "but sometimes it's enough to push a door open." His kindness broke something inside me, that quiet wall I had built against hope. The next morning, I walked barefoot to the university office, clutching the money in my fist as if afraid the wind would steal it. The line for application forms was long, filled with boys in pressed shirts and polished shoes. When it was finally my turn, the clerk behind the desk barely looked up. "Name?" he asked. "Address?" I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? The street near the old market? The house with no number? My voice shook as I gave what little I had to offer. He sighed, filled in the blanks, stamped the form, and slid it across the desk. Holding that form, I felt both powerful and terrified. My hands shook as I filled it out under the shade of a tree outside. I didn't know all the questions. Some words were too complicated. But I wrote slowly, carefully, afraid that one wrong letter might erase everything I had worked for. By the time I finished, sweat had soaked the paper, and my heartbeat drowned out every sound around me. Days turned into weeks of waiting. Long, torturous weeks when sleep refused to visit. Every morning, I walked past the university gate, staring at the notice board, though I knew it was too early for results. The guards still glanced at me suspiciously, unaware that I now carried a secret that would soon rewrite everything. Then one morning, as I passed the gate, I saw a crowd gathered by the board. My heart began to race. I ran closer, shoving through bodies, searching desperately for my name among hundreds of others. The letters swam before my eyes until there it was. My name. My name printed in black ink, as real as the ground beneath my feet. For a long moment I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred. The same gate that had once shut me out now stood before me as a doorway. I wanted to laugh, to cry, to fall to my knees. I walked through it slowly, the echo of my footsteps on the tiled floor louder than any applause I could imagine. That night, I sat by my old stove, watching the flames dance, and whispered, "Mother, I did it. I made it past the gate." The silence that answered wasn't empty. It was full of everything she'd ever believed I could become. On my first day in class, I entered the lecture hall trembling with pride and fear. The air smelled of chalk and paper, the same scent that had once belonged to other people's dreams. I took a seat in the last row, my palms sweating, my heart beating like a drum. Then I heard it, a whisper behind me, sharp and familiar. "Isn't that the nut boy?" The words sliced through the air, and every eye turned toward me. The hawker who had dared to become a student. It's one thing to chase your dream. It's another to sit beside those who once laughed at you. The same voices that had once mocked me from behind iron gates now whispered around me in the classroom, close enough that I could hear every word and feel every stare. I had imagined that walking through those gates would free me from my past, but I soon learned that dreams, once reached, do not erase the scars of the journey. They only expose them under brighter light. The first day of class should have felt like triumph, but it felt more like trial. As I stepped into the lecture hall, carrying the weight of borrowed books and borrowed courage, I could feel every eye measuring me. The murmurs rippled through the rows, low at first, then rising just enough for my ears to catch. "Isn't that the nut boy?" one voice hissed. "He used to sell outside the gate," another whispered. I pretended not to hear, but my skin burned with the memory of all those afternoons spent under the sun. Tray balanced on my head, begging the same people for coins who now shared their notes beside me. Their laughter was no longer loud, but it was sharper, disguised as polite smiles, sarcastic remarks, careless jokes. They mocked the way I spoke, the way I dressed, the way I raised my hand, and said words that didn't always come out right. My accent carried the dust of the streets, and every mispronounced word reminded them that I didn't belong. Some avoided sitting near me, as though my poverty might stain them. I learned to take my seat in the back of the class, silent but attentive, invisible but unbreakable. At night, when others slept, I stayed awake under the weak light of the hostel corridor, reading and rereading every chapter until the words became muscle memory. I studied harder than anyone, not to prove I was smart, but to prove I had a right to be there. I skipped meals to buy notebooks, recycled old papers to make flashcards, and wrote formulas on the walls of my small room so that even my dreams would remind me of them. Money became a shadow I could never outrun. To keep up with tuition, I washed cars at night in a nearby parking lot, the cold water numbing my hands until they cracked. On weekends, I returned to the streets with a smaller tray of groundnuts, wearing a cap to hide my face. It was humiliating at first, serving snacks to the same students who studied beside me, but hunger has no pride, only persistence. Still, in all that chaos, I found a rhythm. My days became a blur of lectures, cleaning shifts, car washes, and study sessions that ended only when my eyes refused to stay open. My grades rose quietly, and soon professors began to notice. The same classmates who mocked me started whispering in a different tone, not of ridicule, but of uneasy respect. I learned that success is the most disarming reply to mockery. One afternoon, as I left the library, I froze in disbelief. There she was, Amina. The last time I had seen her, she was walking toward the hospital gates, carried by grief and memory. But this Amina was older, more composed, dressed in a doctor's white coat, her face shining with purpose. When our eyes met, she smiled softly and said, "You made it." My throat tightened. I wanted to tell her that she had been part of the reason I never gave up, but the words tangled behind gratitude. She said, "Don't quit now. You've only begun." Then she pressed something into my hand, a small pen with her name engraved on it, and walked away before I could thank her. That night, I placed the pen beside my mother's old scarf and promised myself I would never let either of them down again. For a while, it felt like my life was finally balancing study, work, hope. But fate doesn't like stability. It thrives on testing the fragile peace we build. One cold night, after returning from my shift at the car wash, I pushed open the door to my small hostel room and froze. The smell of smoke filled the air. My bed, my books, my few belongings, all burned to ashes. The pen Amina had given me lay blackened on the floor, twisted by fire. My knees buckled, and I sank to the ground, staring at the ruins of everything I had worked for. In the flickering shadows, I understood that success had enemies, and one of them had found me. They burned my books, but not my belief. Fire can swallow paper. It can devour walls and blankets and dreams written in ink, but it cannot consume the stubborn hope that lives inside the chest of someone who has already lost everything once before. As I stood in the doorway of my ruined room, the smell of smoke clinging to my skin, I realized that pain wasn't new to me. Only the shape of it had changed. The ashes still smoked when the warden arrived, his expression somewhere between anger and inconvenience. He asked a few questions, glanced around, then told me to clean it up quickly, as if I'd spilled water, not lost my world. When I begged for an investigation, he waved his hand. "Probably an accident," he said. But accidents don't laugh in the corridors later. 2 days after the fire, I found out who had done it. A group of students, the same ones who had mocked me since my first day, admitted it during lunch, grinning as if they'd played some harmless prank. "It was just a joke," one of them said. "We didn't know it would spread that much." I stared at them, my fists trembling, my mouth dry. "A joke?" I asked. "You burned my books, my notes, my home." They shrugged, unbothered. "You'll manage. You always do." Rage is a strange thing. It burns hotter than any flame, but it's also dangerous when carried by someone who has nothing left to lose. I stormed into the administrative office, demanding justice, shouting louder than I had ever dared before. The staff looked at me as if I had committed a crime, simply by raising my voice. Within an hour, the story twisted. Rumors spread that I had caused the fire myself to gain sympathy. The university board summoned me, and I found myself sitting before a panel of men who wouldn't even meet my eyes. They called it a disciplinary hearing, but it felt more like a trial without mercy. I tried to explain, to tell them the truth, but their faces remained carved from indifference. One of them finally said, "We cannot prove your innocence, but we cannot expel you either. Not yet." They suspended me temporarily, pending further review. My body went numb as I walked out, the walls of the university suddenly feeling like a cage closing in. It was the professor, my old mentor, who found me sitting outside the hall that evening, hollow and silent. He didn't ask what had happened. He already knew. He sat beside me, his hands clasped, his voice calm but firm. "The world has always been cruel to those who refuse to stay where they're placed," he said. "But remember this, if you give up now, you'll make their laughter permanent." Those words cut through my despair, like wind through smoke. I promised him I wouldn't quit. When the suspension lifted weeks later, I returned to class, not with fear, but with purpose. I joined the student union, not for recognition, but to stand for others like me, those who couldn't afford to be heard. I spoke softly at first, then louder as courage grew in me. We fought for better conditions, for fair treatment, for dignity. To my surprise, people listened. Somewhere in that fight, the boy who had once hidden behind his tray learned how to raise his voice. The whispers that once mocked me began to change. Some students who had avoided me now sought my help. I wasn't just the nut boy anymore. I had become something else, someone harder to silence. The fire that tried to destroy me had instead forged me. But strength has a cost, and the world never lets defiance go unpunished. During one of our peaceful protests, police trucks surrounded the campus, the air filled with shouting, tear gas, and panic. I was in the middle of the crowd when rough hands grabbed me from behind. I heard the click of handcuffs, felt the sting of metal on my wrists. As they dragged me toward the truck, one thought screamed through my mind. After all this, is this how my education ends? The clang of the cell door that night was louder than every applause I had ever dreamed of. It was the sound of metal swallowing hope, the echo of injustice turning triumph into humiliation. I had walked into the protest shouting for equality, for fairness, for the right to be seen. But when the gate of the police van slammed behind me, I realized how fragile freedom feels when it is taken, not by enemies, but by the very hands meant to protect it. The same hands that once held my books now hung chained behind my back, trembling not from fear, but from disbelief. The night air inside the van smelled of tear gas and despair. Students cried, shouted, prayed. Others sat in stunned silence, eyes glazed with the shock of betrayal. I tried to speak, to reason with the officers, to explain that we were peaceful, that all we wanted was a voice. But my words vanished beneath the roar of sirens. Every bump in the road drove the truth deeper into me. Knowledge can set you free, but the world still finds ways to cage you for it. The police station was a concrete box soaked in sweat, anger, and hopelessness. They shoved us into a cell already crowded with men whose faces had forgotten what sunlight looked like. The air was thick with humidity, the floor damp with spilled water and regret. When the bars clanged shut, I sat down in a corner, my back against the wall, my mind still replaying the professor's voice. If you give up now, you'll make their laughter permanent. I wouldn't let them win. Not again. Days passed slowly, each one measured not by clocks, but by footsteps in the corridor. I survived on tasteless rice and borrowed faith. In the stillness of night, I recited lessons in my head, refusing to let ignorance creep back in. But even in that darkness, I found something unexpected: solidarity. The other prisoners, mostly street vendors and young men from forgotten corners of the city, listened as I told them stories about education, about second chances, about Amina and the professor who taught me without asking for anything in return. They laughed, they asked questions, and soon I began teaching them simple math, simple words, right there behind bars. It was during one of those nights that a new prisoner was brought in, an older man with a sharp gaze and quiet confidence. He didn't talk much at first, but he listened. One evening he asked me, "Why are you here?" I told him everything: the burned room, the protests, the fight for dignity. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said, "You have a rare story. People forget how powerful hope sounds until they hear it from someone who's lived it." He told me his name was Yusuf, a journalist arrested for documenting the same protest. Over the next few days, he kept asking me questions, not about politics or anger, but about life, about the meaning of learning, about what kept me going. I didn't realize he was memorizing my answers. He said one night, "If I ever get out before you, I'll make sure people know who you are." I thought he was joking, but 3 days later, he was released. I didn't think of him again until a guard rushed to our cell one morning holding a folded newspaper. "You," he said, pointing at me, "you're on the front page." My heart stopped. He tossed it through the bars, and I saw my own face printed beside the headline: "The Groundnut Scholar, the boy who fought books and bars." Yusuf had told my story to the world. By noon, journalists camped outside the station. Students marched again, not in protest, but in support. The university's name buzzed across radios, and my release became a matter of public pride. When the cell door finally opened, It wasn't the same clang I had heard before. It was softer, like redemption being unlatched. The same guards who had shoved me in now avoided my eyes as they let me walk out. The sunlight outside felt heavier than I remembered, warm but blinding. My hands still bore the red marks of the cuffs, yet I held them high as I walked back toward the university, the place where it had all begun. The students cheered when I arrived, some calling my name, others whispering like I was a myth brought to life. But deep inside, I knew I hadn't won anything yet. I had only survived the lesson that pain teaches to the persistent. That night, as I sat by my window in the hostel, staring at the same stars that had once watched me hawk groundnuts, I felt a tremor of fear beneath my pride. The exam results were coming soon, but the bursar's notice was already up. Unpaid fees meant no graduation. My scholarship application was delayed, my savings gone. I whispered into the dark, "After all this, will a few coins be the chain that binds me again?" And in that silence, destiny seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if I could break it one last time. I stood outside the window of my own graduation. The laughter inside drifted through the glass like music from a world that had once rejected me, and I pressed my palm against the pane, feeling both pride and pain at once. I had fought through hunger, humiliation, fire, and prison to stand where I stood, yet a single missing payment had turned triumph into exile. Behind that window, they called names, wore gowns, threw caps into the air, while I stood barefoot in the dust, wearing the same clothes I had hawked in years ago. The week before the ceremony, I had begged, written letters, pleaded for an extension, but bureaucracy does not have a heart, only policies. The bursar had looked at me over his glasses and said, "Rules are rules, young man. Without full payment, you cannot attend." I walked out of his office numb, my body present but my spirit detached. I had made peace with hardship before, but not this. I had dreamed of that day since the moment I first saw the university gate, since the day I promised my mother by her grave that I would walk through it as a scholar. And now, after all those years, I would watch my dream fulfilled, but from the outside. When the morning of the ceremony arrived, the campus was alive with colors. Music blared, families posed for photographs, and the air smelled of flowers and victory. I stood behind a tree near the hall, clutching a small brown envelope that contained the proof of my effort, my degree certificate, issued quietly the previous evening without ceremony or applause. The paper was thin, but to me it felt like a mountain. I ran my fingers across the printed letters of my name, unable to believe that those were truly mine. Through the wide glass window, I could see my classmates seated in rows, their black gowns shimmering under the lights. The vice-chancellor's voice echoed faintly. "Education transforms the soul. It redeems the struggle." I almost laughed at the irony. My struggle had been transformed, yes, but redemption was still waiting for a ride home. I thought of Amina, of my mother, of the professor who had risked his reputation to teach me after hours. They were my invisible audience. As the speeches ended, I turned to leave quietly, not wanting pity or questions. But then I heard a familiar voice calling my name. It was the professor. Older now, his hair thinner, but his spirit unchanged. He was standing near the stage, looking straight at me through the window. "Come in," he said firmly. When I shook my head, he repeated louder, "Come in." Heads turned. The guards hesitated, but he motioned for them to let me through. I stepped inside, hesitant at first, my bare feet echoing softly on the polished floor. The hall fell silent for a moment, the same silence that had followed me since the day I first sold groundnuts outside those gates. Then someone began to clap, one, then another, then the whole hall. The sound rose, wave after wave, until it felt like thunder. I couldn't move. The professor walked over, placed his hand on my shoulder, and whispered, You've earned every bit of this." He led me to the stage, and the vice-chancellor himself handed me a spare graduation gown. The fabric felt like forgiveness, heavy, warm, and undeserved, yet perfectly mine. Tears blurred my sight as I held up my certificate to the cheering crowd. For a fleeting second, I saw the world through my mother's eyes, the boy who had once stood in the dust, now standing under a rain of applause. Yet deep inside, beneath the joy, a quiet ache lingered. I had achieved everything I'd once prayed for, but half of my dream still waited beyond these walls. That evening, as I walked back to my small room, the glow of the setting sun spilling across the campus, I found an envelope slipped under my door. The seal bore the crest of a foreign university. My hands shook as I tore it open. "We are pleased to offer you a full scholarship for further studies abroad." For a moment, the world stopped spinning. But as I read the last line, "Travel and visa expenses not included," the wind outside seemed to whisper a cruel question. What use is a door that opens when you cannot afford the key? The world beyond the airport looked nothing like home, but it smelled like hope. The air was sharp with cold, the buildings towered like giants of glass, and the sky seemed too clean for a man who had grown under dust and smoke. As I stepped out into that foreign land with one small bag and a heart full of gratitude, I realized that dreams have no borders, only prices. And I had already paid mine in sweat, in hunger, and in faith. It took me weeks to raise enough money to buy a ticket. Every friend, every well-wisher, every person who once bought groundnuts from me contributed a coin, a prayer, a promise. The professor arranged letters of support, and even the local newspaper ran a small story. The groundnut boy goes global. When I boarded that plane, my hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of every life that had carried me here. My mother's voice, Amina's kindness, Mr. Salim's lessons, the professor's belief. I wasn't flying alone. I carried their dreams stitched into my heartbeat. The first winter in that foreign city was brutal. The cold cut through my bones, the language tangled my tongue, and every face around me looked too busy to notice the stranger who spoke with hesitation. I had thought education would be my refuge, but classrooms felt lonelier than any street I'd ever sold on. Back home, poverty had been a wall. Here, it was silence. I missed the noise of the market, the laughter of students, even the smell of roasted nuts in the morning air. To survive, I took a part-time job cleaning dormitories. Each night, when the lights went out and the students slept, I scrubbed floors, emptied trash bins, and whispered lessons from my textbooks under my breath. The echo of my mop on the tiles became my rhythm, the scent of detergent my reminder that dignity isn't found in the work you do, but in how you do it. Some nights, exhaustion blurred the lines between studying and surviving, but I never stopped. I couldn't. Every stain I wiped away was another barrier between who I was and who I was becoming. Months became years, and slowly, the loneliness softened. I began to make friends, students who respected my story, professors who saw potential beyond accent or skin. I learned to navigate not just the cold of the weather, but the chill of being underestimated. The day I received my master's degree, I stood on that foreign stage, remembering the groundnut tray that once shaped my shoulders. I smiled because I knew. No journey is too far when it begins with purpose. When I finally returned home, the airport crowd was waiting. Cameras flashed, microphones reached out, and someone shouted, "Welcome back, the groundnut scholar." But I didn't return to fame. I returned to service. I started a foundation for street children, naming it Amina's Promise, in memory of the girl whose words had changed my destiny. We began small. 10 children, 1 borrowed classroom, 1 shared dream. Within a year, our little school had grown into a movement. The media began calling me the Chancellor without a crown, and every time I heard it, I smiled. because the only crown I ever wanted was knowledge, and I had already earned it. Still, late at night, when the world fell quiet, I often found myself staring at the old university's crest printed on my degree. That place had been both my battlefield and my birthright, and though I had built a new life beyond its gates, a part of me still waited for its acknowledgement. One morning, as sunlight poured through my office window, my secretary walked in holding a sealed envelope embossed with a familiar crest, my old university's emblem. My heartbeat quickened before I even touched it. The seal gleamed gold, heavy with authority. I turned it over in my hands, my fingers trembling as I broke it open. Inside were just a few lines, yet the words burned brighter than any fire I had known. You are hereby invited to serve as Chancellor of the University. For a moment, the room spun, and I could only whisper to myself, the hawker had come home, not to sell, but to lead. The letter said, "We invite you to serve as Chancellor of the University." For a long time, I simply stared at it, unable to breathe. My hands trembled as I traced the embossed crest, the same symbol that once hung above a gate that had shut me out so many times. It felt unreal, like destiny itself had circled back to correct its own handwriting. The same soil that had once swallowed my tears was now calling me home, not as a hawker, not as a student, but as its highest voice. The day I returned to the university, the air felt different. The sun leaned softer, the wind slower, as if the entire world was pausing to remember. My car stopped in front of the old iron gate, and for a moment I didn't move. I looked at the rust along the bars, the same rust I used to brush against while waiting with my tray of nuts. The guards saluted this time, their faces respectful, unaware that years ago their predecessors had chased me from the same spot. I stepped out slowly, my chancellor's robe heavy with the weight of memory. Each step I took across the courtyard felt like walking through time. Students lined the pathways, applauding, their eyes bright with admiration. None of them knew my story, not the hunger, not the ashes, not the years of cleaning floors and studying by candlelight. To them I was just another name in gold letters, another figure of authority. But inside, I was still that boy who had dreamed from the other side of the gate, still that son who had promised his mother that he would turn shame into strength. The ceremony was grand, speeches, cameras, banners fluttering in the wind. When I took my oath as chancellor, I could see the professor in the front row, older now, his eyes glistening with quiet pride. I spoke about perseverance, about the power of education to turn broken beginnings into luminous destinies. The applause that followed was thunderous, but I barely heard it. My heart was somewhere else, out by the roadside, beyond the noise, where another life once began. When the ceremony ended, and the hall emptied, I asked my driver to stop by the same old street that had once been my universe. The market had changed, but its soul hadn't. The smell of roasted nuts still hung in the air, that familiar scent of survival and simplicity. And then I saw him. A young boy, maybe 12, balancing a tray of ground nuts, his face streaked with sweat and determination. His eyes met mine with the same mix of exhaustion and pride that I once carried. I walked toward him, my robe trailing behind me, and for a moment he hesitated, unsure why a man dressed in silk and metals would approach him. "How much for the whole tray?" I asked. His voice shook when he named the price. I smiled, paid him double, and said softly, "You remind me of someone I used to know." He blinked, confused, but grateful, and I could see his lips trembling between fear and disbelief. I took one handful of roasted nuts, feeling the warmth seep into my palm. The scent carried me back through years, to my mother's laughter, Amina's smile, Mr. Salim's lessons, and the professor's steady hand on my shoulder. Every struggle, every scar, every step had led me back here, not to prove anything, but to give back what the world had once given me. A chance. Turning to the crowd gathering nearby, I spoke to the boy so that everyone could hear, my voice calm, but filled with the weight of truth. Greatness doesn't begin in palaces. It begins in persistence, I said. It begins when you refuse to let where you start decide where you'll end. As I turned to leave, I pressed a folded note into the boy's hand and said, "Keep the change. You'll need it for your admission form." His eyes widened. His mouth opened as if to speak, but words failed him. I walked away slowly, the echo of my steps merging with the sound of his quiet sobs. And as the sun dipped low behind the university towers, I realized that my journey had never been about escaping the streets. It had been about lighting the path for those still walking them. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that no beginning is too small. Subscribe now for more powerful real-life journeys that prove persistence always finds a way. Tell me in the comments, what did you learn from the Groundnut Boy's story? Your one click, one word, one share keeps stories like this alive, and together we'll keep turning pain into purpose.